Pate choux is the base for profiteroles, cream puffs, and eclairs. These crisp, tender, and airy pastries are deceptively simple to make if you understand the technique. By the way, this lesson is from our Cream-filled Pastries class, out now on ATK Classes on the America's Test Kitchen app. In this class, we'll talk about classic French pastries like eclairs, profiteroles, and Choux Craquelin, crisp but tender pastries stuffed with rich, creamy fillings. Pate choux is the base of these pastries. You'll learn how to make, pipe, and bake this dough into different shapes. You'll also learn the technique for making pastry cream, the versatile custard filling. Beyond that, we'll discuss the science of steam, share some piping tips, and make a glossy, intense chocolate sauce. But first, let's talk about choux. Now, like most doughs, this one starts with flour. I have some all-purpose flour here. Anytime you're baking, it's really important to measure your ingredients. But in this recipe in particular, we want to make sure that the ratio of flour to our liquids remains constant. So I'm going to weigh my flour. I have my scale here. Now I'm looking for a half cup of flour, but since we're weighing it, we're looking for 2.5 ounces. Now we're going to take this a step further because we want to make sure that the flour is nice and fine before it goes into the rest of the mixture. So I'm going to sift this. I have a fine mesh strainer here, and since we have such a small amount, I'm just going to do this. We're sifting the flour after we've weighed it. And as you can see, this is just going to make sure that we don't have any clumps of flour going into our dough. Now, not all recipes for pate choux will have you do this, but it's never a bad idea. You can work the flour through by either tapping your hand on the side of the fine mesh strainer, or you can use your spoon to stir it up a little bit inside. As you can see, the flour is nice and fine, no clumps, and that's going to give us a nice smooth choux paste. Okay, now that the flour is ready, we can talk about our eggs. I'm using 3 eggs in this recipe, but only 2 whole eggs. So I'm going to crack these into my measuring cup because we're going to measure the total amount of eggs that we're using. I'm going to use my egg on egg method where we're just using the strength of one of the shells to crack the other shell. I don't really care if my yolk gets pierced for these 2 eggs. So for the second one, I can use the edge of my measuring cup. For my final egg, I just want the white from this. We want this paste to be nice and rich, but we're going to add a little extra structure from 1 egg white. So I'll crack this on my board, and I'm using a 3rd bowl to separate my egg. I like to use my fingers to separate eggs. Some people like to use the shell to go back and forth, but you can use your fingers and let the white just drain through them. So in this case, I'm gonna put my whites in with my 2 whole eggs. I can save my yolk for something else, and I'm gonna wash my hands before we continue. When it bakes, pate choux dough will expand up to 2 or 3 times its original size. And that's not because we're adding any chemical leaveners to this dough. There's no baking powder, no baking soda. What we are adding are eggs. So we have the 2 whole eggs and the 1 egg white. These eggs are adding richness, they're adding some structure, and they're adding a lot of steam. And it's the steam from the eggs and the other liquid that we're adding that's going to allow the dough to expand and rise as it bakes. So we're going to whisk the eggs and the egg whites together so they're nice and cohesive. You should have about half a cup. As long as you're using large eggs, you should be right on target. If you have much more than half a cup, you want to get rid of some of the excess. Okay, that is all good to go. Now we can talk about the rest of the ingredients. I have 5 tablespoons of unsalted butter that I've cut up into 10 chunks. We want to have smaller pieces of butter so that it will melt quickly in our liquid. Most recipes for pate choux use water. Some use a combination of water and milk. Both liquids are going to hydrate the dough and provide steam. I'm adding 6 tablespoons of water, that's 3 ounces, and 2 tablespoons of whole milk, which is 1 ounce. In addition to providing steam for the pate choux, the milk is also adding some sugars, which will help with browning on the outside. Now, if you think about it, we started with half a cup of flour, and we're adding 6 plus 2 is 8 tablespoons of liquid to this mixture, which is half a cup. So by volume measurements, our amounts of flour and liquid are equal. That's why it's important to make sure that you're weighing the flour and measuring your liquids correctly. Finally, I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons of sugar and 1/4 teaspoon of salt to season the dough slightly. It should not be very sweet, nor should it be salty. We just want to make sure it has a nice, complex flavor. Now I'm going to turn my burner onto medium heat, and we want this to come to a boil, but we want to make sure the butter is melted completely before that happens. So give it a few stirs. That's why it's important to make sure the butter is cut up into smaller pieces. We're starting to boil, so I'm gonna turn off my heat, and especially if you have an electric stove, you're gonna take this off the heating element. And now we're gonna add the flour carefully so it doesn't go all over the place. And we're gonna stir this in until it's combined. Be a little careful at first because the flour will go everywhere. You can see this looks kind of like mashed potatoes. It does not taste like mashed potatoes, so resist the urge to stick a finger in. If you don't sift your flour, you may see little balls of flour in the dough. It's really hard to break that up once it goes in, so sifting is a good idea. Once the dough is more or less in one clump and it pulls away from the pot and it looks nice and thoroughly mixed, you don't see any dry bits of flour, move back onto your burner. Now I'm going to turn my heat back on to low. And while this is over low heat, we're going to just smear the dough across the bottom of the pan. We want to get good surface contact with the dough so it's exposed to the heat on the bottom of the pan. What we're doing right now is essentially pre-gelatinizing the starch. So this is similar to the Tongjiang method that we use in some of our bread recipes, where we're cooking the flour initially with the liquid, and it's making this paste. And cooking the starch is going to allow it to absorb more liquid, which will make a dough that's easier to rise. It's gonna be a little stickier, but it's gonna give us a nice, loose, airy crumb, which is what the whole thing of pâte à choux is, because we basically have a crust on the outside and it's hollowed out on the inside. And what we're looking for is the fat, the butter fat inside, to kind of come to the surface. You'll see some beads on the dough and you'll start to see some fat on the bottom of the saucepan. You want to keep your heat low though, because we're not trying to brown this. As you can see, it's getting very shiny on the surface. And if I look at the bottom of my saucepan, I can see some fat droplets starting to gather there. That's a really good sign. And as always, there's one way to test this for doneness, and it helps if you kind of bunch the dough up into one section. We want the dough to be between 175 and 180 degrees. Okay, we're done. We'll put our dough right into the food processor bowl. I'm gonna take the insert out of the feed tube. I'm gonna let this run for about 10 seconds. The dough is quite hot right now, and we'll cool it down just slightly. Now I'll let the food processor continue to run, and while it's running, I'm gonna stream in my eggs slowly to let them fully incorporate. Now I'm just gonna scrape down the sides, make sure that all of the dough is getting mixed in with all of the eggs, and we'll let this run for about 30 more seconds. So what we have is a nice, smooth but sticky dough. And the food processor didn't just make the whole process easier, but it also is gonna allow the dough to be more successful in the oven. Because it really worked on those egg proteins, it helps them to relax and unwind, and that's going to make the dough stretchier and better able to puff really nicely in the oven. This choux paste is ready to work. If you're not gonna pipe right away, you want to transfer this to a bowl and cover it with a piece of greased parchment paper, flush against the surface, and it can sit at room temperature for about 2 hours. And that's it. Now you're ready to pipe into puffs or eclairs. Check out the recipe videos in this class to put your choux paste to work. Now that you know how to make pâte à choux, you're ready to take the next step. And with ATK classes, you'll get access to a wide variety of lessons filled with masterful techniques, helpful videos, and step-by-step photos. From knife skills and making hand-rolled pasta to baking and frosting incredible cakes and so much more. Download the America's Test Kitchen app and start learning with ATK classes today.